Chapter 101. How the Admiral sent canoes from Jamaica to Española, with word that he and his people were marooned there. When we were thus fortified in the ships as strong as we could be, a crossbow shot from land, the Indians of that country, who proved to be kind and gentle people, presently came in canoes to barter their wares and provisions for our truck. That the trade might be on an equal basis, and neither side gain more than was just, the Admiral placed 2 men in charge of the traffic, and it was agreed that whatever the ship's people obtained by trade would be divided among all, in shares. By that time we had nothing aboard to eat, for we had already consumed the greater part of our provisions. Much had spoiled, and as much again had been lost in the haste and disorder of the embarkation from Belen. We being in such straits, God was pleased to bring us an island abounding in eatables, and densely inhabited by Indians eager to trade with us, so that they came from all directions. For this reason, and that his people might not disperse throughout the island, the Admiral preferred to fortify himself aboard, and not ashore. Our people being by nature disrespectful, no punishment or order could have stopped them from running about the country, and into the Indians' huts to steal what they found and commit outrages on their wives and children, whence would have arisen disputes and quarrels that would have made enemies of them. And if we had taken their food from them by force, we would later have suffered great need and privations. But this did not happen, for the men were confined in the ships, and no one could go ashore without getting permission and signing out. The Indians were so grateful for this that they freely brought all we needed in exchange for our things. For 1 or 2 fuchsias we gave them a lace point. For a large cake of cassava bread, which is made from grated roots, we gave 2 or 3 strings of green or yellow beads, and for a large quantity of anything, a hawksbell, with an occasional gift of a mirror, red cap, or a pair of scissors to the caciques or nobility to keep them happy. By these means we were assured of a plentiful supply of provisions, and the Indians were glad to have us as neighbors. As some means had to be found of returning to Castile, the Admiral held several meetings of his captains and other leading men to discuss how this might be done. It was idle to hope that some ship might come that way, and there was no possibility of building a new vessel, for we had neither the implements nor the artisans needed for the task, unless we allowed ourselves a long time, and even then, such a makeshift vessel would not do, considering the westward-running winds and currents among those islands. So it would only be a loss of time, and cause our total ruin instead of averting it. After many conferences, the Admiral determined to send messengers to Española with the news that he was marooned on Jamaica, and the request that a rescue ship laden with provisions and ammunition be sent to him. For this mission he chose 2 reliable and courageous men. Certainly courage was required to make that crossing in the only way it could be done. That is, in Indian canoes made by hollowing out a large log. When heavily loaded, these dugouts are 3/4 underwater. Moreover, the crossing had to be made in medium-sized canoes, for the smaller ones were too dangerous, and the larger ones too slow and cumbrous for such a long voyage. In July 1503, having found 2 suitable canoes, the Admiral ordered Diego Méndez de Segura, chief clerk of the fleet, to sail in one, and Bartolomeo Fieschi, a Genoese gentleman, to sail in the other, each taking a crew of 6 Christians and 10 Indian paddlers. On reaching Española, Diego Méndez should proceed to Santo Domingo, and Fieschi should return to Jamaica with news of Méndez's safe arrival in order to spare us worry and fear that he might have perished. This could easily happen with such flimsy craft if the sea turned at all rough. Indians do not run such great risk, for they can ride a capsized canoe while swimming in the sea and get back in. However, honor and necessity incite men to face the greatest risks, so Méndez and Fieschi set out down the coast of Jamaica toward the east end of the island, which the Indians called Eomaquique, after the cacique of that province. This end was 33 leagues from Maima, the place where we had beached our ships. The distance from Jamaica to Española being 30 leagues, with only one little island or rock along the whole course, and that some 8 leagues from Española, they had to wait for a perfect calm before starting to cross that great space in such frail craft. By God's favor, this calm soon came. The Indians having entered the canoes with their gourds of water, some cassava bread and some other native food, and the Christians having taken their places, equipped only with their swords, shields, and provisions, they put out to sea. The Adelantado, who had accompanied them to the eastern end of the island to protect them against attack by Indians at the takeoff, watched the canoes until at nightfall they vanished from sight. Then he leisurely returned to the fleet, urging the Indians he encountered on the way to be friends and trade with us. Chapter 102. How the brothers Porras and many of the people rose up against the admiral, saying they wanted to go to Castile. After the canoes had left for Española, the people in the caravels began to sicken, both because of the hardships they had endured on the voyage and because of the change in their diet. By this time, all the Spanish food had been consumed. They had no wine to drink or any meat to eat save the flesh of an occasional hucha that they got by trade. Even those who were wealthy thought it a hardship to be confined so long to the ships, and began to conspire and grumble, saying the admiral had no intention of returning to Spain, whence the Catholic sovereigns had banished him, and they said he had even less intention of returning to Española, where he had been forbidden to land at the start of that voyage. His true purpose in sending those canoes was not to obtain ships or relief, but to enable Méndez and Fieschi to go to Spain to try to fix up the admiral's business with the Catholic sovereigns. While those negotiations were going on, he proposed to pass his exile right there. Otherwise, why had Bartolomeo Fieschi not yet returned as he was supposed to do? And suppose that Méndez and Fieschi had perished at sea? What then? Why, in that case, they must help themselves, for no one else would. They could not count on the admiral to help them escape, for the reasons stated, and because he was so afflicted with gout that he could hardly get out of bed, much less endure the hardships of a canoe voyage to Española. There was nothing for them to do, then, but go off by themselves while they still enjoyed good health, for the admiral could not stop them, and in Española the reception would be all the better for coming without him. The whole world knew of the bitter enmity and hatred of Governor Ovando, the knight commander of Leres, for the admiral. And when they got home to Spain, they would enjoy the favor of Bishop Juan de Fonseca and the High Treasurer of Castile, Morales, whose lady love was a sister of the brothers Porras, the ringleaders of the conspiracy. As for the Catholic sovereigns, they would doubtless look on them with favor, being easily persuaded that it was all the admiral's fault, as they had been at the time of Roldan's mutiny on Española. They would be glad of an excuse to strip the admiral of all his privileges and free themselves of all their commitments to him. Made bold by these and similar arguments of the brothers Porras, one being captain of the Santiago and the other comptroller of the fleet, 48 men signed the articles of the mutiny, choosing Captain Porras for their leader, and they carefully prepared for the day and hour of the outbreak. On the morning of January 2nd, 1504, the mutineers being armed and ready, Captain Francisco de Porras entered the admiral's cabin and said to him, "Senor, what do you mean by making no effort to get to Castile? Do you wish to keep us here to perish?" From his insolent tone, so unlike his usual manner, the admiral immediately guessed what was afoot, and replied calmly that he knew no way of going home until a ship was sent, that he was second to no man in his desire to leave, both for his own good and that of the men for whom he was responsible, that if he, Porras, had any other plans to propose, he should submit it to a council of the captains and other officers for discussion, and that he would call as many meetings as were necessary. Porras replied there was no time for talk. The admiral must decide either to embark or stay with God. Then, turning his back on the admiral, he cried out, "I'm for Castile! Who's with me?" All his henchmen immediately set up a cry, "We're with you!" And running about in great disorder, arms in hand, without any order or plan, they quickly occupied the castles on the round top on the mainmast, some crying "Death to them!" and others, "To Castile! To Castile!" and still others, "Sir Captain, what do we do now?" Although the admiral was in bed, so crippled with gout that he could not stand, he nevertheless got up and hobbled to the scene of the mutiny. But 3 or 4 honest fellows, his servants, fearing the mutineers might slay him, forced him with great difficulty to return to bed. Then they ran to the Adelantado, who lance in hand was bravely defying the mutineers, and they took the weapon from his hand by force, and shut him up with his brother. They begged Captain Porras to go with God and not be the cause of a murder, which was bound to harm them all, and for which he would certainly be punished. They said none would seek to hinder him from going. When some degree of quiet had been restored, the mutineers took 10 canoes which were tied up to the ships. The admiral had scoured the islands to procure them in order to keep the Indians from using them against the Christians, and also to have them for our use. And they set out in them as gaily as if they were embarking from a harbor in Castile. At this, many who were not mutineers but were desperate at the thought of being abandoned there by the greater and healthiest part of the company also piled into the canoes, to the great distress of the few loyal men and of the many sick who were convinced they were doomed to remain and perish there. If all had been in good health, I doubt that 20 of those people would have stayed with the admiral. The admiral now came out of his cabin to comfort his men as well as the posture of their affairs allowed. Meanwhile, the mutineers under Captain Francisco de Porras cruised in their canoes toward the east end of the island, from which Diego Méndez and Fieschi had begun their crossing to Española. Wherever they called, they inflicted outrages on the Indians, robbing their food and other possessions. They told the Indians to collect their pay from the admiral, and authorized them to kill him if he would not pay. They also told the Indians he was hated by the Christians and was the cause of all the misery of the Indians on Española. It would inflict the same suffering on them if they did not kill him, for it was his intention to stay and settle the island. On the first calm day after the mutineers reached the east end of Jamaica, they set out for Española, taking some Indians to paddle the canoes. But the winds being variable and the canoes overloaded, they made slow progress and were not 4 leagues out when the wind turned contrary. As a result, they grew frightened and decided to put back. Since they were not skilled in handling canoes, water began to come over the sides, and in order to lighten them, they threw overboard everything except their arms and enough food to get ashore. But the wind grew rough, and becoming more frightened, they decided to kill the Indians and throw them overboard. Some they killed right away. Others leapt overboard and swam until exhausted, and when they tried to rest by clinging to the gunwales, their hands were hacked off by the mutineers. They killed 18 in this way, sparing only a few needed to steer the canoes. This was the Indians' reward for listening to their false promises and their pleas for aid. Having come ashore, the mutineers were of divers opinions as to what they should do. Some were for going to Cuba, believing that the easterly currents and winds at the place where they were would swiftly bear them there, and that from Cuba to Española was an easy jump. They did not know the 2 islands were 17 leagues apart. Others favored returning to the ships, and either making peace with the admiral or taking by force all his arms and goods. Still others thought they should wait for another period of calm weather and again try to cross to Española. They decided this last was the best course, and stayed in the village of Aomaquique over a month in wait of a fair wind, living off the Indians. When a calm set in at last, they made 2 more efforts to cross, but both failed because of contrary winds. They gave up that vain attempt and started back westward on foot, very chopfallen and downcast, sometimes eating what they could find and at others, robbing food from the Indians, according to the power or show of resistance made by the local cacique. Chapter 103. What the admiral did after the mutineers had left for Española, and of the shrewd use that he made of an eclipse. After the mutineers had departed, the admiral did all he could to hasten the recovery of the sick. He also took care to treat the Indians well, that they might continue to bring in provisions for barter. He was so diligent in this work that the Christians presently recovered full health, and for a time, at least, the Indians continued to bring food. But as they are an indolent people who will not cultivate on a large scale, and we consumed more in a day than they in 20, as they were now well supplied with our goods and saw so many of us there, they began to be influenced by the arguments of the mutineers. As a result, they began to bring in less food than we needed. This posed a serious problem, for in order to get food from them by force, most of us would have had to go ashore prepared to fight, leaving the admiral to face great danger in the ships. On the other hand, to depend on their goodwill meant privation, and having to pay twice what we had paid before. For the Indians understood our situation and their business very well, and believed they had us at their mercy. So we were greatly perplexed, and did not know what to do. But God does not forget one who trusts in him, as the admiral did, and suggested to him a means by where we might get all the food we needed. The admiral recalled that in 3 days' time, at midnight, there would be a total eclipse of the moon. So he sent an Indian from Española, one of our company, as a messenger to summon the principal men of the province to a feast and a palaver. The day before the eclipse, the chiefs having arrived, he told the gathering through an interpreter that we were Christians and believed in God, who lived in heaven and were his servants. God rewarded the good and punished the wicked, as he had punished the mutineers by not permitting them to cross over to Española, as Méndez and Fieschi had done, and by causing them to suffer many trials and dangers, as the Indians well knew. As for the Indians, God was very angry with them for neglecting to bring us food for which we paid them by barter, and had determined to punish them with famine and pestilence. To convince the incredulous, God would send them a clear token from heaven of the punishment they were about to receive. They should therefore attend that night the rising of the moon. She would rise inflamed with wrath, signifying the chastisement God would visit upon them. The admiral having spoken, the Indians departed, some frightened, and others scoffing at his threats. But at the rising of the moon the eclipse began, and the higher it rose, the more complete the eclipse became, at which the Indians grew so frightened that with great howling and lamentation they came running from all directions to the ships, laden with provisions, and praying the admiral to intercede with God that he might not vent his wrath upon them, and promising they would diligently supply all their needs in the future. The admiral replied that he wished to speak briefly with his God, and retired to his cabin, while the eclipse waxed, and the Indians cried all the time for his help. When the admiral perceived that the crescent phase of the moon was finished, and that it would soon shine forth clearly, he issued from his cabin, saying that he had appealed to his God and prayed for them, and had promised him in their name that henceforth they would be good and treat the Christians well, bringing provisions and all else they needed. God had now pardoned them, in token of which they would soon see the moon's anger and inflammation pass away. Perceiving that what he said was coming true, they offered many thanks to the admiral and uttered praises of his God as long as the eclipse continued. From that time forward they were diligent in providing us with all we needed, and were loud in praise of the Christian God, for they believed that eclipses were very harmful, and since they were ignorant of their cause and of their regular recurrence, and did not suspect that men living on earth could know what was happening in the sky, they were certain that his God had revealed that eclipse to the admiral. Chapter 104. How another conspiracy was formed among the admiral's people, and how this conspiracy was quenched by the arrival of a caravel from Española. 8 months had now passed since the departure of Diego Méndez and Bartolomeo Fieschi, without any news of them, and this caused the admiral's people much anxiety. Some, suspecting the worst, said they had drowned or had been killed by the Indians of Española, or had died on the way from sickness and hardships. They knew that from the east end of Jamaica to the town of Santo Domingo in Española stretched over 100 leagues, a very difficult navigation by sea on account of contrary winds and currents, and of travel over very rugged mountains by land. To heighten their fears, some Indians claimed they had seen a derelict boat drifting down the coast of Jamaica. The mutineers may have spread this rumor to cause the admiral's people to lose all hope of rescue. Being quite certain that all chance of relief was gone, one Master Bernal, an apothecary from Valencia, secretly began to hatch another conspiracy on the order of the first one, into which he drew the majority of the men who had been sick. But our Lord, seeing the great danger the admiral was in, was pleased to avert it by the arrival of a small caravel sent by the governor of Española. This ship arrived one afternoon and anchored near the grounded ships. The captain, Diego de Escobar, came aboard and informed the admiral that the knight commander of Leres, the governor of Española, sent his compliments, and regretted that he had no ship large enough to take off all the admiral's men, but hoped to be able to send one before long. The captain then presented the admiral with a barrel of wine and a slab of salt pork, and immediately returned to the caravel, sailing away that same night without even taking letters from anyone. The admiral's people were much comforted by the coming of that caravel, and covered up the plot they had been hatching, though the speed and secrecy with which the ship departed made them suspicious, and they were easily persuaded that the knight commander Ovando did not want the admiral to return to Española. This coming to the admiral's notice, he told them it had been his doing, because that caravel was too small to take them all, and he did not want to leave without taking them all. Nor did he wish to stay behind lest it cause new quarrels and negotiations with the mutineers. The truth was that the knight commander feared the admiral's return to Castile, for he suspected that the Catholic sovereigns would restore the admiral to his office and deprive him, Ovando, of his government. That is why he would not help the admiral go to Española, sending instead that little caravel to spy on him and report how he might be totally destroyed. This the admiral knew from a letter sent by Diego Méndez in that caravel in which he told of his voyage and what happened to him thereafter. This is the story he told. Chapter 105. How the admiral learned what happened on the voyage to Diego Méndez and Fieschi. The first day out of Jamaica, Diego Méndez and Fieschi had a fine calm, through which they cruised till evening, urging the Indians to paddle as hard as they could with the sticks they used for paddles. The heat being intense, the Indians refreshed themselves from time to time by swimming in the sea. Moving over tranquil waters, by sunset they had lost sight of land. At nightfall, half the Indians took their turn at paddling, and as many Spaniards at guard duty. This last was a precaution against any betrayal by the Indians. They paddled all that night without resting, and by daybreak were utterly fatigued. Each captain urged on his men, and sometimes took a turn at the paddles, and having taken some food to regain their strength after such a hard night, the rowers returned to their work, seeing nothing but water and sky. It could be said of them what was told of Tantalus, who having water but a few inches from his lips, could not quench his thirst. Our men suffered greatly on account of the folly of the Indians. From the great heat of the past day and night, they had drunk all the water, heedless of future needs. As the sun rose in the heavens, the heat and their thirst grew ever worse, so that by noon they were completely exhausted. By good fortune, the captains had each brought along a small water cask, from which they kept doling out a few drops of water to their Indians, just enough to sustain them till the cool of the evening. They encouraged them with the hope of soon raising Navassa, which is 8 leagues from Española. The Indians were not only worn out from thirst and from having paddled 2 days and a night, but were thoroughly discouraged and convinced they were off their course, since by their reckoning they had paddled 20 leagues and should already have sighted Navassa. It was exhaustion and faintness that deceived them, for even with hard paddling, a canoe cannot make more than 10 leagues in a day and night, on account of the currents running counter to the course from Jamaica to Española. That night, one of the Indians died of thirst. Others were stretched out on the bottom of the canoes, and the rest were so weak and dejected that they made almost no way at all. Still, they pushed along, wetting their mouths with salt water, which was the comfort afforded to our Lord when he said, "I thirst." And so they continued until night fell for a second time, without sight of land. They being emissaries of one that God wished to save, he caused it to pass that at the rising of the moon, Diego Méndez observed that a small island covered its lower part like an eclipse. Had it not been for this, he could not have seen the island, which was very small and looked even smaller at that hour. Méndez joyfully pointed it out to the others, and by doling some of the contents of the water cask to the paddlers, so strengthened them that the next morning they were up to the island. They found it a bare rock, half a league round. Landing as best they could, they offered up thanks to God for his mercy, and as the island was treeless and without springs, they scrambled from cliff to cliff, gathering water in gourds, and found such an abundance of it that they could fill their stomachs in vessels. Although advised not to drink too much, some Indians drank their fill and died. Others were made dreadfully sick. Overjoyed at being within sight of Española, they rested that day till the afternoon, larking about and eating shellfish that they had found on the shore and cooked, for Méndez had brought flint and steel for making fire. Then, fearing the onset of rough weather, they prepared for the last leg of their voyage, and in the cool of the evening pushed off for Cape San Miguel, the nearest point on Española, and made it the morning of the next day, being the 4th day since their departure. After resting 2 days, Bartolomeo Fieschi, stating on his honor as a hidalgo, proposed to return as the admiral had ordered. But since his people were mere Indians and sailors, exhausted and ill from their labors and from drinking sea water, not a man would come with him, for the Christians regarded themselves as having been delivered from the whale's belly, their 3 days and nights corresponding to those of the prophet Jonah. Diego Méndez, who was in great haste, had already left in his canoe along the coast of Española, though he was suffering from a quartan ague, caused by his great privations by land and sea. Striking inland, he proceeded with his men over wretched paths and rugged mountains to Zaragua, the western province of Española, where the governor then was. Ovando pretended to be pleased by his arrival, but delayed sending him forward for a long time, for the reasons indicated above. By great persistence, Diego Méndez at last secured his permission to proceed to Santo Domingo to purchase and outfit a ship with funds and revenues the admiral had there. Having made a caravel ready and provisioned it, he sent it to Jamaica at the end of May 1504, and himself took ship for Spain, as the admiral had ordered, in order to report to the Catholic sovereigns the happenings of his voyage. Chapter 106. How the mutineers spurned the admiral's offers and refused to treat with him. The admiral and his people being much relieved by news of the safe arrival of Diego Méndez and the coming of the little caravel by which they had assurance of their rescue, the admiral decided to inform the mutineers of what had happened in the hope of bringing them to obedience. He sent as emissaries 2 respected persons who were on friendly terms with them, and as proof that the caravel had actually arrived, he also sent them a portion of the salt pork that Ovando had presented to him. When these emissaries came to where Captain Porras and his trusted lieutenants awaited, Captain Porras came out alone to meet them because he feared they brought an offer of a general pardon, which his men might be persuaded to accept. But he could not keep his men from learning of the arrival of the caravel, of the excellent health and spirits of the admiral's people, or of his offer of such a pardon. After several parleys between the emissaries and Porras and his lieutenants, the latter declared they did not trust the admiral's offer of a safe conduct and pardon. However, they would gladly leave the island if the admiral promised to give them a ship in case 2 arrived. If only 1 was sent, he should assign half the space to them. Meanwhile, since they had lost at sea all they had gained by barter, he should share with them what he had. The envoys began to say that these conditions were unreasonable and unacceptable, but the mutineers broke in with threats that if the admiral did not give them what they asked, they would take it from him by force. Then they dismissed the envoys, rejecting the admiral's offers. They told their followers the admiral was a cruel and vengeful man. For themselves they had no fear, as they had friends at court. but he might vent his wrath on the others, calling it condign punishment. That was why Roden and his men had not trusted the admiral's offers on Española, and see how well their enterprise turned out. Assuredly, it would be the same with them. In order to dispel any effect the coming of the caravel with news of Méndez's safe arrival might have on them, they assured their men this was no real ship, but a phantasm, conjured up by magic arts of which the admiral was a master. Clearly a real caravel would not have left so soon, with so little dealing between its crew and the admiral's men, and surely the admiral and his brother would have sailed away in it. With such words they hardened their followers' mutinous spirit and egged them on to march on the ships to take by force all they could find and make the admiral their prisoner. Chapter 107. How the Adelantado sallied forth to meet the mutineers near the ships, and defeated them, capturing Captain Porras. Persisting in their wicked design, the mutineers marched to within a quarter league of the ships, to an Indian village called Maima, where the Christians later founded a city named Seville. When he learned of their intention, the admiral sent his brother the Adelantado in an effort to bring them to their senses, with soft words, but backed him up with a large enough force to repel any attack. So the Adelantado selected 50 well-armed men who were ready to strike hard blows if the need arose. Having come to a hilltop a crossbow shot from the village where the mutineers were, the Adelantado sent 2 men who had gone on the first embassy in another effort to make peace, inviting their leader to a conference. But the mutineers were not at all inferior in number to the loyalists, and being for the most part sailormen who held the admiral's men in contempt as cowards, who would not fight, they would not even allow the envoys to address them, drawn up in battle formation and crying, "Kill! Kill!" They fell upon the Adelantado and his men. 6 of them had earlier sworn to keep together and seek out the Adelantado, thinking that once he was slain, the others would give no trouble. It pleased God, however, that the affair turned out very differently, for at the first encounter 5 or 6 of the mutineers were struck down, most of them being men who had sworn to kill the Adelantado. He fell on his enemies so fiercely that in a short time were slain Juan Sanchez of Cadiz, who had let the Jabayan escape, and Juan Barba, who first drew his sword at the time of the mutiny. A number were badly wounded, and Captain Francisco de Porras was made prisoner. Seeing themselves so roughly handled, those vile mutineers turned tail and ran away with all their might. The Adelantado wished to pursue them, but his lieutenants restrained him, saying that it was well to punish, but in moderation. If they killed too many, the Indians who could be seen looking on, arms in hand, might get it into their minds to attack the victors. The Adelantado followed their advice, and returned to the ships with Captain Porras and other prisoners. He was joyfully received by his brother the admiral, and those who stayed with him, all offering up thanks to God for this great victory, by which those proud and wicked men were punished and abased. On our side, the only hurt was suffered by the Adelantado, who was wounded in the hand, and by the admiral's chief waiter, who had died from a slight land stroke in the side. As for the rebels, Pedro de Ledesma, the pilot who had gone with Vicente Yanez to Honduras and who swam ashore at Belen, fell over a cliff, and was hidden from sight that day until nightfall of the next, only the Indians knowing where he was. Curious to know how our swords cut, they opened up his wounds with little sticks. He had a cut on the head so deep that one could see his brains, another on the shoulder, which was almost severed, so that his arm hung limp. One thigh was cut to the bone down to the shin bone, and the sole of one foot was sliced from heel to toe, so that it resembled a slipper. Despite these wounds, when the Indians annoyed him, he would growl at them, "Get away, or I'll do you a mischief." And these words alone caused them to run away in great alarm. When the ship's people learned of his plight, they came and brought him to a palm-thatched hut nearby, where the dampness and mosquitoes alone should have finished him off. Having no turpentine, the ship's people used oil to cauterize Ledesma's wounds, which were so numerous that during the first 8 days of his cure, the surgeon swore he was always discovering new ones. Yet he recovered at last, but the chief waiter, for whose life none feared, died. Next day, Monday, May 20th, the other mutineers sent envoys to plead humbly with the admiral to be merciful to them, for they were repentant and wished to rejoin his service. The admiral granted them a full pardon, but insisted on keeping Captain Porras a prisoner, that he might not be the cause of new disturbances. As so many people could not be comfortably lodged and fed and kept at peace aboard the ships, where there was not enough food for even one of the 2 bands, and as he wanted to avoid the exchange of insults that might revive buried quarrels, the admiral decided to place the former mutineers under the command of a captain who should tour the island with them, trading with the Indians and keeping them occupied until the coming of the ships, whose arrival was daily expected. Chapter 108. How the admiral crossed over to Española, and thence to Castile, where our Lord received him into his holy glory in Valladolid. A few days after these events, which reduced the mutineers to obedience and made the Indians better disposed to provision us with food, it was 1 year since our arrival at Jamaica. At this time, the ship that Diego Méndez had purchased in provisions in Santo Domingo with the admiral's money arrived. In this ship we embarked, friends and enemies alike. We set sail on June 28th and experienced considerable difficulty because of the contrary winds and currents on the course from Jamaica to Santo Domingo, where we joyfully put in on August 13th, 1504. The governor received the admiral very hospitably and lodged him in his own house, but it was a scorpion's kiss, for at the same time he released Captain Porras, the ringleader of the mutiny, and proposed to punish those who had been responsible for his imprisonment. Ovando also proposed to intervene in other matters, in offences which concerned only the Catholic sovereigns who had sent the admiral as captain general of their fleet. So the governor's compliments to the admiral were as false as his smiles and pretense of joy at seeing him. Matters went on in this way until our ship had been repaired, and another vessel chartered in which sailed the admiral, his relations, and servants, most of the others choosing to stay in Española. We sailed on September 12th, after we had left the river and proceeded 2 leagues out to sea. The main mast of the ship split right down to the deck. The admiral then sent this ship back, and we continued in our ship toward Castile. After sailing with fair weather almost a third part of our course, we had a terrible storm that placed us in great jeopardy. The next day, Saturday, October 19th, the weather having cleared, and we being easy, the main mast broke in 4 pieces. But the valor of the Adelantado and the ingenuity of the admiral, who could not rise from bed on account of his gout, contrived a jury mast out of a lateen yard, which we secured firmly about the middle with ropes and planks taken from the stern and forecastles, which we tore down. In another storm, the foremast was sprung. It pleased God that we sailed 700 leagues in this manner until we reached the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda. From there we went to Seville, where the admiral had relief from his many hardships and exertions. In May 1505, he set out for the court of the Catholic king. The glorious Queen Isabella had passed to a better life the previous year. Her death caused the admiral much grief, for she had always aided and favored him, while the king he always found somewhat reserved and unsympathetic to his projects. This was clearly shown by the reception that his majesty accorded him. He received him courteously and professed to be restoring all his rights and privileges, but it was his real design to take them all away. And this he would have done before his sense of shame, which is a powerful force in noble souls. His Highness and the Serene Queen had dispatched the admiral on his voyage of discovery. Now, however, that the Indies were giving signs of that which they were to become, the Catholic king begrudged the admiral the large share that he had in them by virtue of his capitulations with the crown. The king wished to regain absolute control over them and dispose as he pleased of the offices that were only the admiral's to grant. He therefore proposed to negotiate a new capitulation with the admiral, but God would not permit it. For at that very time the most serene King Philip I came to the throne of Spain. And even as the Catholic king departed from Valladolid to receive him, the admiral, who was much afflicted by the gout and by grief at seeing himself fallen from his high estate, as well as by other ills, yielded up his soul to God on the day of the Ascension, May 20th, 1506, in the city of Valladolid, having received with much devotion all the sacraments of the Church, and said these last words: In manos tuas, Domine commendo spiritum meum. God, in his great mercy and goodness, assuredly received him into his glory. Ad quem nos cum eo perducat. Amen. His body was afterwards borne to Seville, and buried in the principal cathedral of that city with funeral pomp. By order of the Catholic king, over his tomb was placed an epitaph in the Spanish language that read, To Castile and Leon, Columbus gave a new world. These words and that gift are truly worthy of note. History knows of no man who ever did the like, wherefore the world will ever remember the first discoverer of the West Indies. Afterwards, passing over to the mainland, Hernando Cortez and Francisco Pizarro found many other provinces and great kingdoms. Thus, Cortez discovered the province of Yucatan, together with the city of Mexico, called New Spain. Together with the city of Mexico, called New Spain, then held by the great Montezuma, the emperor of that part of the world. And Francisco Pizarro discovered the kingdom of Peru, which is very large and wealthy, possessed by the great king Atabalpa. From those provinces and kingdoms there come to Spain every year many ships, laden with gold, silver, Brazil wood, cochineal, sugar, pearls, and precious stones, and many other things of great value, on account of which Spain and her princes today are in a flourishing condition.